white people are smarter than black people. Feel free to go down below now and call me a Nazi. All done? All gone? Okay, everybody that's left. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. So let's try that again, shall we, without the clickbait intro. Hello, YouTube. According to a study, white people score higher on IQ scores than black people, statistically. I believe it was a Pew research study or something. I'm not sure what it was. It's not irrelevant because I'm not here to discuss the data or critique it in any way. It's just, it got me thinking. I've actually been thinking about this for quite a while. It's like a couple of years now this has been going through my head because I've been trying to parse it all. What I'm interested in is, this is data, you know, these are all based on actual statistics. The bell curve for white people starts at a higher point and ends at a higher point than it does for Negroids. Caucasians score higher. There's only a few points in it, and the highest and lowest ends, obviously, they taper off in different ways. I mean, I remember hearing about a white guy actually, who had an IQ of like 14. It's a very firm statistical outlier. Usually the curves start around somewhere around 60 and end around 130-ish. But there are always exceptions that go way beyond that. But yeah, basically, the black one starts here, the white one starts here a few points further apart, black one ends here, white one ends here a few points apart. So why? Could it be genetic? I mean, is it possible that black people, Negroes, are just genetically less intelligent than white people? It's possible, I suppose. You know, genetics are very complicated. It is entirely possible that something to do with the amount of melanin in your skin just suddenly reduces your IQ, or your potential IQ, or whatever. But I find that unlikely, because the highest scoring demographic of all are people from Singapore, and Singaporeans are typically very dark. They're also quite short people overall compared to both white and black people. The average height is something like 5'7". Anyway, but they're very, very dark. However, they're not as dark as Africans. So maybe it's just like this sweet spot with the amount of melanin that you get, and when it gets too much, your IQ starts to drop off again. But I find that unlikely. And there's another thing that confuses me about the statistics. You see, the brain is an extremely greedy organ. It uses something like 65 to 80% of all the energy that you take into your system goes to the brain. So here's the thing that gets me. Typically speaking, overall, black people also tend to be larger than white people, tend to be the largest overall. I think the tallest group of all is actually Caucasian, somewhere in Scandinavia, where the average height for women is something like 6'2" and men is like 6'5". But typically speaking, black people tend to be taller, pound for pound, as the one single, the one racial demographic, which means they have larger systems, which means they have the more place to store food within their bodies, which means they obviously can provide more energy for it. So what's going on there? I don't think it's genetic. Now, it is possible because, again, Singaporeans tend to be shorter, which means the rest of their body won't need as much calorific intake, pound for pound, freeing up more to go to the brain. But I find that unlikely, because although when you look at somebody who's, for example, I'm 6'3", my wife's 4'11", if you look at the difference between us, it's very significant. But if you look at the actual organs, each one is only slightly smaller in her case. So overall, you put them side by side and you won't see significant, massive differences, apart from in some specific ones. It's a bit more difficult to judge between male and female, because female organs obviously have the uterus, so they tend to be a bit squished there. So let's compare it to another woman that's the equivalent size. The lungs would be about the same size, maybe an inch or two, probably not even that much. Like the pancreas will be like half an inch smaller, that kind of thing. Put them side by side and they look basically the same. So I don't think it's genetic. I really don't. So what is it then that leads to these statistical differences? Is it something to do with, is it physiological rather than genetic? For example, black people, Africans, they have larger, wider noses to allow more air to get in because, Africa's a hot place, it's almost desert-like, so the air's thinner, so you need to be able to breathe in deeper. You need a larger nasal cavity to get in enough oxygen to keep yourself going. They also tend to be quite tall and slim, genetically speaking. They've adapted to that environment because you being taller and slimmer allows you to not absorb as much heat, as well as the melanin, of course. It lets you keep cooler in a warmer environment, whereas people that grew up in cold environments, like my ancestry is Scandinavian, we tended to be bulkier in frame, more room for fat to insulate against the cold. Also tended to have large noses, but they hook in slightly so that the air can go in and sort of wiggle around a little bit and heat up before it goes into the system, because you don't want cold air inside your lungs, because that's going to lower your body temperature. So maybe that's something to do with it. Maybe the Caucasians that have grown up, genetically speaking, have adapted to more temperate environments. Maybe it's just a more efficient way of getting that energy to the brain. But I don't know, that doesn't work for me, because pretty much across the board, just look at professional sports. Black people, black athletes tend to dominate, so they clearly have some sort of genetic or physiological advantage when it comes to energy, the way it's transmitted through the body. And if they get that for running and jumping and stuff, then clearly, logically, you'd expect it's also going to be more efficient going to the brain, right? Better energy transfer. But again, maybe it's possible that that's just the adaptation has gone in that direction, has led to adaptation for running faster and being more physical. So it's possible, I suppose, but again, I find that unlikely. So the most likely thing, I think, is it's cultural. Not in the sense that I think that white people are just more driven, because that's clearly the case in a lot of Asian countries. We all have the stereotype: if you're Asian, you must be good at maths, for example. But that is a cultural driving force. Parents in Asian countries really push their kids to go and learn and excel as much as possible. A lot of them burn out because of it. Again, I'm not saying that white people push more than black people, or black people push less than white people. But there's always a cultural element in the way people think, the way people behave. It's always true. And when we look at black people around the world, of course, there's some very intelligent black people. Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of the smartest people alive. He's black. A personal friend of mine works for Johns Hopkins University, an incredibly bright person. He has a really sharp mind. So it's not that black people are just inherently stupid and can never succeed. But if you look at across the board, mostly, no matter where they're coming from, black people tend to be in poorer areas. Now, I don't have statistics showing what the difference is, or I haven't found statistics. I'm not going to show statistics anyway, but I've never actually looked at the statistics showing the difference between poor people and rich people. But I'm absolutely certain that, generally speaking, people with money, better access to education, will have a higher bell curve than those who come from a poor background, because you have more access to it. Now, IQ isn't education per se. How smart you are has nothing to do with how educated you are. However, if you lack certain basic education, you're going to struggle more with the questions on an IQ test. Some of them, for example, are based on understanding of language and mathematics. If you have poor understanding of language and mathematics, it doesn't matter how smart you are, if you can't read the question, you can't answer the question. Which brings me back again to people being poor. I've met some, I'm not going to say stupid people, I've met some people that clearly aren't extremely intelligent, but are very knowledgeable about a specific subject because it's something that they've trained in. And I've met people that are clearly extremely smart but don't know basic things, the whole Dunning-Kruger effect. I've met some people that are incredibly smart but don't know simple things like CPR, which you'd think everybody would know. It's pretty much ubiquitous in the world now, or at least I thought it was, but clearly it isn't, because if you've never come across it, it doesn't matter how much you know. If you don't know something, you don't know something. I did very poorly in high school at my actual exams, but I can explain string theory to you. Not because I'm smarter than anybody else, because I've studied that. It's something I find interesting. I can tell you a lot about planets, gravitational lensing, and all that kind of thing. I can't tell you in detail. You're not going to get an education from me that'll do you well in school, but I know these things not because I'm smart, but because I've studied in my own time. I've looked into these things, which again leaves me thinking it's a cultural thing, or more accurately, it's an environmental thing. Because I grew up in a fairly poor area. I grew up in our version of a ghetto, I suppose you could call it. We call them council estates here. My parents were on welfare. However, I'm also in the UK, where education is freely available for everybody up to the age of 18, and even past that with certain schemes and stuff. So I had more opportunity to it in that respect. But there was a time when I was going to college, when I was 21, 22-ish, and I physically could not afford the bus fare to get to the college, and it was too far away for me to realistically walk there and back. I mean, if I'd have been determined enough, I could have. I used to know a kid who would walk 5 miles to his college and then 5 miles back every day, so it's possible. But there wasn't the same imperative there for me. I was doing okay, I was doing well enough. I didn't have somebody pushing me to excel. And when you're in a poor environment, or less wealthy or whatever, your priorities shift. Education becomes less important. Long-term goals become less important than the more immediate. If you don't know where your next meal is coming from, if you don't know when your next meal is coming, if you don't know if your next meal is coming, and I've been in that situation, if you're in that place, you don't give a fuck about learning. You don't give a fuck about education, because there are more important things on your mind, like survival. Literally, that might seem like hyperbolic, but there are people in those situations. And generally speaking, across every nation, black people statistically more commonly fall into those groups. Not even extreme poverty, just tenuous situations where the desire to get a job in the short term to provide for yourself and your family becomes more important than spending a few more years getting a PhD or a degree or Bachelor of Arts or whatever and going on to a really good career down the line, because you don't know if you're going to be able to make it there. So that's what I think is the difference. I don't think, in fact I am absolutely certain, that black people are not just dumber than white people, the same way that I don't think Singaporean people are smarter than white people. I think it's idiotic to draw any lines like that based on such an arbitrary distinction. There need to be significant differences before you can take into account the actual genetic composition or the demographic of a person. And a significant difference is the difference between access to food and not having access to food. If you don't have food, that's far more important than learning about Nietzsche. Shocking, I know. So those are my thoughts on it. There are other factors that could be at play, of course, but I'm sure that there's at least a degree of genetic and physiological influence in there. You know, it's too complicated for it not to be. But whether it's a significant factor or not, I don't know. Because I mean, you'll see across the board. Typically speaking, men run faster than women. There are more chess grandmasters that are male. In fact, there are no females that I'm aware of. Um, Competitive gaming, men tend to do better than women. You could argue there's a genetic component there because there are much more noticeable differences between men and women in a number of factors, including pure physiology. Men are larger, stockier. The muscle mass is different. You know, a man and a woman are the same height and build. The man will still have a physical advantage because of the composition of the muscles, but that doesn't mean that the man's going to do better. So again, it probably comes down to something of an environmental nurture aspect. This whole nature nurture debate, it's not nature versus nurture. It's not one or the other. It's always both. There's always an element of both that comes into play, and we do tend to see that boys tend to be, one of two things happens with boys. Either they get pushed to be, you know, they have to be the breadwinner, they have to be the provider, they have to do well to provide for their family, provide for themselves, whatever it is, or they get neglected. I mean, it's not that straightforward, obviously, but let's say that the two extremes are there. The people that tend to go on and do well, they come from one of these two parts. They've either been pushed consistently and encouraged, or they've had no encouragement at all, and they found it in themselves and been like, fuck you, I'm gonna go do it anyway. Whereas with girls, we don't see that as much. I personally, I have two daughters. One of them's 15 now, and what I've always encouraged in her, not because she's a girl, but because this is what I would encourage all my kids, is to be happy in life, not to be mega successful and mega rich. Do what makes you happy. Everything else will sort itself out somewhere along the way. I firmly hold to that. So my kids probably aren't going to go on to be world famous and excel in any field or other. And that's fair enough. I don't think you need to be a multi-billionaire to be happy. I'm very happy right now, and we're still in a financially somewhat iffy situation, but I'm happy with my life. I have a beautiful partner, I have beautiful children, I have a comfortable home, I have a warm place to sleep, I have food in my belly, I have my amazing Princess Belle cup that my wife bought me. So again, you'll see this often with black people as well that have succeeded. They tend to come from one of two groups. Either they've been constantly pushed, or they haven't been pushed at all. That friend I mentioned earlier from Johns Hopkins, he was encouraged a lot, went through some very difficult periods. I don't want to go into too much detail because that's his story to tell, but you know, I understand this is all anecdotal. I completely get that. It could be completely wrong, and if you have more concrete data that you can show me, by all means do so. I want to see it. And anyway, he didn't do very well, but he came to a realization that there were more important things in the long term than in the short term, to the extent that when he was looking after his child, he often sacrificed his health in favour of what his child needed, whilst pushing to go and get into a position where that never needed to happen again. Children are a big motivator for things like that. Believe me, I know this from personal experience. You'll go and do things that are bad in the short term because you know that the long term benefits are better. I don't want my kids to ever be in the situation I was in where I was literally eating once a week. And I don't mean I was having one meal a week. I mean I was eating once a week. There was a time when I had a tub about this big of chocolate powder you make hot chocolate with. It's the only thing I had to eat for an entire week, for 10 days. I don't want my kids to ever be in that situation, not even close. So I spent a lot of money now that I can't really afford to get my youngest child a lot of fresh fruit, because she loves fresh fruit, especially strawberries. And because I don't want her to know what it's like to be hungry. I'd rather put the pressure on myself than on her. There are other things I'm doing as well to improve the situation in the long term. And I think that's what it really comes down to. People who come from impoverished backgrounds, one of two things happens. Either they get stuck in the cycle where they feel like they're completely unable to do it, or they fight through and they make sure it's not going to happen for the kids after them. But despite what some people might tell you, to bring this back on track, black people aren't living in abject poverty all around the world. There are some, absolutely, but there are some people living in abject poverty all around the world. Most black people in impoverished situations grew up similar to what I did, where we got enough to get by. So it was always enough, or it felt like it was enough at the time. So there isn't that pressure to succeed, as well as there not being that real opportunity to do so, especially in places like America where you have to pay for education and healthcare. Don't even get me started on that. Meanwhile, in black countries, the infrastructure isn't there, so of course that's kind of skewed the results, isn't it? I mean, how can you do an IQ test on somebody who literally had no access to education at all, because it literally doesn't exist? It's just not practical. Long story short, no, black people are not stupid. White people aren't super geniuses. There are black men and women that are very intelligent. There are white men and women that are not very intelligent. There are Asian people who are very intelligent and not very intelligent. People. These are people. There are some people who are very intelligent, some people who are not, and they fall in between. So, although the statistics are important in this case, because it does show there's a deficit somewhere, there's a disparity. At the end of the day, all they mean is that demographic needs something that this demographic has. And typically that comes down to opportunity, care, education. That's what I think. And I think I'm on the money with that one, so if anybody else has anything else they'd like to add to it, or wants to prove me wrong, say the statistics are wrong, feel free. I will genuinely look at anything you have to show me. I'm not going to be like, nah, you're wrong. Feel free to tell me I'm wrong though, if you like, if that's what you want to do. Feels good to finally get this out of my head, because it's been rattling around in there for quite some time. So, that, as they say, is that. Thank you for watching. Or not, if you didn't. Then again, if you didn't, what difference does it make?